I don't know if you want to try. Every time you see. Do you remember when we fell in love? We were young and innocent then. Do you remember how it all began? It just seems like heaven, so I didn't. Do you remember? I bet you remember back in the fall. I bet you remember ever again all day long. I bet you remember. Do you remember? I bet you remember us holding hands. I bet you remember at each other's eyes we share. Tell me, do you remember the time when we fell in love? You remember the time when we first met, girl? Do you remember the time? When we fell in love, you remember the time? Do you remember how we used to talk? You know, we stay on the phone and night till dawn. Do you remember all the things we said? Like I love you so I'd never let you go. Do you remember? I bet you remember back in the spring. I bet you remember every morning birds were saying. Do you remember those special times? It's going on in the back of my mind. Do you remember the time? When we fell in love. You remember the time when we first met, girl? Do you remember the time? When we fell in love. You remember the time and those sweet memories will always be there to me. And girl, no matter what was said, I will never forget what we had. Now baby, do you remember the time? Do you remember when we fell in love? You remember the time and when we first met, girl? Do you remember the time? When we fell in love. You remember the time? Remember my baby? Do you remember the time? 'Cause I remember when we fell in love. You remember the time? All in my mind, girl. Do you remember the time? When we fell in love. You remember the time? Remember my baby? Remember the time? Woo! Remember the time? Do you remember, girl? Remember the time? On the phone, you and me, till dawn, till 3. What about us, girl? Remember the time? Do you? In the park, on the beach, you and me, in the vein. What about? Remember the time? Woo! In the park, at the dark. Do you? Did you Remember the time. Yeah, yeah. Woo! Remember the time. Remember the time.